Okay, so welcome Sajeev Mohankumar, who is a senior technical specialist at FAIRR, which is an investor network specifically looking at sustainable food solutions and farmed animals, also, right? Particularly. So, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, Sajeev, and your background, and what inspired you to get involved with FAIRR?
Yeah, that's an easy question to start with. I can talk about myself. No, but yeah, like you said, Sajeev Mohankumar, Senior Technical Specialist in the Climate and Nature team at the FAIRR Initiative. Um, I think before I go into talking about FAIRR, my own background, I'm from India. I come from a state called Kerala, which is the southernmost state in India, very close to Sri Lanka, essentially. And yeah, as growing up, I mean, I think my family was agrarian, so they used to grow rice, so very familiar growing around rice. But we also had like subsistence livestock as well. So we had some, cattle as well. So growing up, I think we were part of the system where I had to help them harvest the grains, dry the grains. We were kids. We used to get a bit of pocket money for doing that. Also grew up, sort of tying cattle when it comes to grazing them. And for a long time, I thought they were my best friends. So I had that kind of a bit of an emotional connect as well with livestock, right? But as any typical Indian studious kid would do, obviously went into engineering. So I did my engineering, I did my chemical engineering in India, and then I flew to the States where I pursued a master's. And that's where my first connection or technical connection with agriculture came into being, because I was looking at biofuels, cellulosic biofuels, and how they feed into like the energy policy in the US, trying to calculate whether it makes sense from a climate perspective to include them in the energy portfolio and so on. So kind of got into a bit of the weeds of agriculture essentially, right? I did another master's to looking at adaptation, how farmers can change their practices to be profitable under a changing climate. But I really got the understanding of how farming works in the Midwest, mainly from a corn and soybean perspective, and also realized that food is not only, I mean, livestock. I mean, agriculture is not only for food; it's also for fuel as well, right? With the biofuel angle. Also understood that a lot of it also goes into feeding animals. So there's a big animal feed component to it as well. It's not just about growing livestock. Then I made my way to the Europe, to Austria, where I did my PhD, focusing on livestock. So kind of came full circle in terms of looking at crops and livestock. And there was more like, obviously they have a lot of pork and beef and dairy in Austria. So looking at how you can sort of lower the carbon footprint of livestock production there. Finished my PhD, went into postdoc, the full academic route, and that's when I came to the UK. I worked for an institute called Rothamsted Research in the UK. They're one of the oldest agricultural research institutes in the world. Did a lot of empirical modeling, published quite a bit of papers. But just to cut the long story short, I kind of felt like my impact was limited to publications, which my peers would read, but it doesn't really change anything in terms of how corporates behave or how investors operate. So I moved into consulting, worked for Carbon Trust and South Pole as a senior consultant. And that's when I kind of really understood the corporate side of things, right? The value chain and the supply chain, how corporates are setting targets and what are they trying to do? What does sustainability mean for the boardrooms and so on? So that was a really good outlook. And after that, I joined FAIRR. And FAIRR essentially is our theory of change is quite different because we work with investors, right? We work in the listed space where investors who invest in some of these agri-food companies and how can we sort of help them transition to be more sustainable. So that's sort of my journey. And I think I have a very technical background, obviously, as you can see from my master's and PhD. But I think the more and more I delve into this field, I understand that the agri-food system is very special. It's not just a technical aspect, right? It's also about culture. It means a lot to people when they eat food, and the association with food brings a lot of memories and nostalgia. And at the same time, it's also a livelihood for a lot of people around the world. So any decisions that we need to take in terms of transitioning needs to be taken with that in mind. And it's not just a profitability issue, but there's other issues connected to it as well. And that makes it a very exciting but complicated field to work in. So yeah, I'm happy at FAIR, and we are fighting the good fight.
Yes. So, FAIRR stands for Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Initiative, which is a great acronym for a very complicated uh, sentence. So clearly, the attention is on farm animals, farming, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, how big of a role does meat and dairy farming play in climate change? Because, people are focused quite a lot on energy, aren't they, at the moment? But I mean, I know that that kind of farming and agriculture has a bigger impact than people realize. So how big is the effect, and what's FAIRR doing to try and address this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you want to look at it from a holistic standpoint, I would kind of use the planetary boundaries framework to understand that. So it's a framework, again, a Stockholm Resilience Center, which came up with it. Now it's been updated by the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. So essentially, what it's saying is that there is climate and nature impacts from any sector, and it sort of shows us where we are as a planet in terms of the tipping points and which are some irreversible changes that has happened to the planet, right? And 6 out of those 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed from overall human activity. But agriculture, like I said, is unique, right? Because it's not only a sector that is contributing to this, and I'll get into some of the specifics as to how it does, but it's also a sector that's deeply dependent on some of the climate and nature benefits. So obviously clean water, soil, air, and so on, right? When it comes to the agri-food sector and climate change, it's a sector that contributes to a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of like second only to energy, right? It's more than transportation, buildings, and so on. So I think that's quite a big contribution. But not only that, it's sort of like the agricultural production takes around 77% of all agricultural land. And again, livestock production itself takes around that, right? Because animal feed that you feed to the animals, but also the grazing of livestock and so on. So again, the number one driver of deforestation and land conversion is sort of the intensive animal production. But it's not only that. Again, it consumes 30% of global freshwater. It's a huge, contributor from that side as well, and dependence from that side as well. But it also depletes, like, in terms of your resources in a way that, if you're applying synthetic fertilizers and chemicals to your soils, that leaches into your water bodies. So it's not only a question of water availability, but it also impacts water quality. And then there is this question of antibiotics, right? So it's one of the sectors that is fed the most amount of antibiotics. And again, I think this antibiotics then, stays in the soil, stays in the animals, then comes into humans. And again, there is a bit of a problem with that as well from a health aspect. So again, I think this sector, the way it operates at the moment, contributes to across the different planetary boundaries, be it climate change, deforestation, biosphere integrity, water pollution, soil pollution, and so on. So it's a sector that needs to be transformed. And that
Mm.
is a theory of change at FAIRR, right? And coming to your second question, as to what FAIRR does. So FAIRR is an investor network essentially, and we work with over 450 investor members, and that constitutes around 80 trillion US dollars in assets under management. So quite a massive number in terms of like the influence that we have. And
Yeah.
in a nutshell, what we try to do at FAIRR is sort of use our investor network as a conduit to shape corporate sustainability practices so that we can facilitate the transition towards a more fair, and just agri-food system transition. And we give investors a variety of tools and resources to do so. So that's a part of my day job, essentially. So I'll just run through a couple of examples of what we do, right? So one of the things that investors really value is how companies are operating and information about how companies operate. So we have something called as the Protein Producer Index, which looks at 60 of the largest protein producing companies around the world. And we have thousands of KPIs spanning climate, nature, social, governance issues, and so on. And we give investors a detailed deep dive into these companies. So when they are assessing, their performance or impact on their own portfolios, they're able to get that information. But it's not only about these raw numbers, right? We need to convert that into investor speak, let's say, which is around financial materiality on their portfolios. Like, what does these climate and nature targets or commitments or how they operate influence like their profitability and the P&L? So we also try to do that. We have tools and resources which sort of take that information and turn that into financial materiality implications on investor portfolios. So investors can then understand it's not only a morality issue, but it's also a materiality issue. We also have a lot of thematic research that we do on regenerative agriculture, risks within the agri-food system, opportunities within the agri-food system, and then we sort of communicate that to investors. But we also have something called as collaborative engagements. And this is where we bring corporates and investors on the same table to have conversations around climate, nature, social governance issues. And this enables investors to really speak to some of the CSOs and the CFOs and the board members to really like instill in them the fact that they care about climate and nature commitments and what companies are doing in the space and try to influence a bit of their behavior and change how they operate, right? I mean, so these are the most powerful investors in the world, talking to some of the biggest companies in the world, and that's a theory of change essentially. And we also have a policy team because we feel like policy is also important in this conversation. It's not only about investors and corporates. So we also talk to G20 ministries or G7 ministries again, giving investors a voice to be a part of some of these important discussions. So quite a
Yeah.
bit of stuff that we do at FAIRR. Yeah.
Well, yes. And um, so do you find that there is a big appetite from your investors to put their money into these sorts of companies, these companies looking at alternative proteins, etc.?
I think alternative proteins is an interesting one, right? I think investors are interested in any sort of solutions because from a risk standpoint, I think they really understand that climate and nature risks are material to their portfolios. So they cannot invest in a company and expect the company to produce the way they produce in an intensive manner for the next 50 years. So that's definitely not sustainable. They understand the implications, and you can see like soil health declines, yield declines, weather extremes, and so on. And also like politically, like some countries are going to be very difficult to be producing the same amount of food. So I think they need to protect their portfolios and look at the long-term resilience of that. So there are a range of solutions, right? And cultivated meat or cell-based meat and others are one of the solutions. And there is appetite in terms of diversifying because if you're a smart investor, you're not going to put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, you're going to diversify that, right? So they look at regenerative agriculture, maybe on the production side, but they also look at like tackling food loss and food waste on the consumer side. But they can also look at alternative food tech, but also plant-based food products as well. So all of them together, I would say it's a basket of solutions. So I would say it's like an album, right? There's no single hit. You gotta buy the full package. I would say so. And there's appetite. We see that from a risk standpoint, from a risk management, but also there are some forward-thinking investors looking at opportunities because they think that this would be the future. This would differentiate them in the market, and they yield to like kind of stand to yield benefits from sort of making that transition.
Hmm. I mean, there has been a bit of a glut over the last sort of 5 years or so, hasn't there, in investment in this space? I mean, there was a big in 2020, 2021, it was, or and 22, it was booming, and then it kind of flagged a little bit. But now you think it's starting to look up again?
Um, okay, so I can talk about both all solutions, right? I mean, regenerative agriculture, what we've seen is that we did a piece 2 years ago where we looked at 79 agri-food companies and their sustainability disclosures, trying to see, okay, which companies are talking about regenerative agriculture in general. 50 out of those 79 companies explicitly mention regenerative agriculture in their sustainability strategies. That's an annual revenue of 3 trillion USD. So that's one third of the entire agri-food sector. So it's not a fringe movement anymore. Companies are really interested in this. And again, so I think so there's interest in that. Investors are also caring about this because their assets and their companies, their portfolio companies are looking at regenerative agriculture. On the other side, I mean, on the I mean, food tech and the cell-based, plant-based side and so on. I think yeah, obviously there is a bit of a blip now, and I think there is this regulatory concern as well, right? I think not all countries are sort of favoring a cell-based meat, so there is that hurdle to be overcome. So I think that's definitely something that's concerning. But we see an interest in sort of hybrid products, where you mix plant-based with like some of these alternative food technologies, and that could come into the market quite a bit. We see some innovation on the pet food market. So I think, again, if it's not for human consumption, pet food could be an avenue to like sort of do that. But there is a lot of concerns among investors, right? I mean, rightly so, because I mean, obviously the taste and texture conversation will continue to go on. Is that going to be replicable? And then the labeling issues. And this again comes back to a bit of the regulatory side. Can we call cell-based meat meat, or is that going to be labeled in a different way? again, there is some concerns around energy consumption as well. I mean, so these are quite energy intensive. So do we get renewable energy to sort of substitute that so you can bring the footprint even lower? And how is that scalable, right, in all emerging markets and developing countries and so on? Is that the right sort of way to like transition? Again, the just transition element comes in as well. But the most important thing is affordability. I mean, it's not affordable. It's not cost effective at the moment to be able to scale. So I would say like there is a blip, but like I said, like any smart investor, if I was investing, I would diversify my portfolio. So I would look at all solutions.
Okay. So yes, we hear the term regenerative agriculture quite a lot. Can you explain what it is and how is it different from conventional farming?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, and I don't have a definition
Okay.
for you in terms of regenerative agriculture. And I think that is fine. That is fine because it is sort of like when you look at the practicalities of farming, I mean, you don't want to be very prescriptive in terms of what farmers can do because farming is very context specific, where you operate, what commodities you're operating, which region you're operating in, and so on. And again, the financial capability and the technical capability of farmers also differ. So regenerative agriculture is a spectrum. And I would say it's a practice that works with nature and not against it. And usually it gives more back to nature than what it extracts. And
Okay.
that is what separates regenerative agriculture from conventional agriculture, where it's more of an extractive process, where you're extracting a lot more from nature than you're giving back. So that would be sort of my definition or take on regenerative agriculture, right? And you can see that in practice, obviously cover cropping or no tillage or having hedgerows around the edge of farms, integrating animals with trees or vegetation. These are some of the methods where you kind of produce food. So you are operating on the land, but at the same time, you're also taking care of the land, ensuring that it's resilient and stands to produce food for the longer term than sort of conventional practices where you would strip the soil bare of all the nutrients because you're planting the same crop over and over again. So there's no like resilience for the soil, there's no breathability for the soil, it can't bounce back. And then you have to then supplement that with chemical fertilizers to ensure that there's nutrients, which again leads to high emissions. Your nutrients get leached into water bodies, creating additional problems. So it's sort of like taking the route where you are respecting the natural limits and then kind of farming in that way. And that would I would say it's more regenerative.
Right. Okay. Now I grew up in the countryside. I actually grew up on a dairy farm and I remember as a kid because my father actually worked on the farm that there was a sort of 3 year kind of farming practice that you would put your field to crop 1 year, then you would leave it fallow, and then you would have kind of cattle grazing on it, and then you could put it to crop again. Did that change at some point so that when fertilizers were used, that they could kind of keep growing crops on the same field year after year after year? Is that what's happened?
Yeah, I think we're going more on the intensive side because obviously the demand for, let's say, animal proteins have gone up, right? I think, and globally, if you look at that, I mean, all of the emerging countries now also has a big demand for dairy or meat, etc. So it's not possible to, one of the things about regenerative farming, like you said, it's about respecting the carrying capacity of the land, so you might leave the land fallow, and now it's alien to a lot of farmers to do that because, they need to produce food. At the same time, like the way we produce food has also changed. Like I said, when I was in the US, a majority of the crops grown on land, which are perfectly good for growing food, is animal feed. So
Right.
you're growing that to feed the animals and then you eat the animals, which is one of the most inefficient ways, I guess, to, when you look at the energy transfer. And a lot of the ranchers I spoke to in the US, I usually go for these events and I speak to ranchers. I mean, they're completely against it. They said that this is perfectly good land. You could use it for growing vegetables or you could grow for like staple crops, which can be used for human consumption. And let's have grazing livestock in areas where, you cannot grow food. So
Mm.
so that's a kind of mindset. But I think with the advent of like some of the agri input providers, the chemical manufacturers, the seed manufacturers, and so on. I mean, they sell all of their products as a package, right? I think you kind of buy into that philosophy of like growing the same seed. You can't save your seeds. You can't be like a bit more diverse or sort of rotate your crops and so on. You're sort of like buying the seeds and then you're applying the fertilizers. But the soil itself has lost the ability to regenerate or have its own fertility. So you need to supplement it with all these chemical fertilizers.
Yeah.
And given the demand for food that's going on, I think farmers are forced to sort of transition and produce at that rate as well, right? And I mean, and they operate in a very risky environment. It's already like, the margins are very low. So I think again, this kind of transition and this sort of like shift to something that's more exhaustive, like regenerative, requires the right policy support and the right corporate support and the right financial support, which they don't have. So the easy way and the most comfortable way is to stick with the status quo, and the status quo, unfortunately, now is intensive farming.
Yeah, and so animals are kept inside, and rather than kind of letting them graze, they grow the feed for the animals and feed them inside. Which, yeah, so and so intensive farming is part of the problem. You've said before that as part of a solution to that problem is kind of nature based rather than kind of technology based. So I mean, what is that? What is the sort of nature base? Is it what you've just been discussing around hedgerows and kind of less using less fertilizer, kind of allowing fields to go fallow, and that sort of thing? Are these the sort of nature-based solutions, or are there any other ones?
No, that's an interesting question. So I think what we try to do, because I can speak about this all day long, but I think I need to like back this up with estimates and numbers, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we try to do with this work that we did, where we again use this planetary boundaries framework, which has this nine boundaries, which has climate and elements of nature in it, right? And what we did was we looked at all of the company performance and disclosures from the data we collected. So what are companies doing in terms of solutions to mitigate climate and nature impacts? We also looked at like literature to look at some emerging solutions, right? I mean, what is happening in the field? So we came up with 22 such solutions, and we had like 12 sort of nature-based solutions classified, let's say classified like that, and 10 tech-based solutions. So nature-based, refers to all of the stuff that we spoke about, where you work in tandem with nature, using nature's ability to mitigate climate and nature impacts. Tech based would be you would use external sort of engineered methods or external inputs to achieve the same climate change, mitigation or nature prevent nature loss. What we saw was that when we drove these 22 solutions to this planetary boundaries framework, we wanted to capture what impact it has across the different planetary boundaries. So nature-based interventions positively impacted five out of the nine planetary boundaries on average, the 12 of them. And when we look at the tech-based solutions, they only positively impacted three out of the nine planetary boundaries. So what that shows is that if you embrace nature-based practices, you have more positive impacts on climate and nature opposed to the tech-based interventions. So let me give an example. Maybe that makes it more clear. Something like silvopasture, right? I mean, that is the process of where you combine animals with trees or sort of vegetation, and you're grazing it, but at the same time you have vegetation around it. What that does is that it obviously sucks carbon into the soil because of the vegetation. The animals are excreting on the soils, so there's fertilizers and manure for the vegetation or whatever crops that you want to grow there. At the same time, you're also providing shade for the animals, so there's a high welfare situation there as well. And again, you're preventing the leakage of any sort of manure and others to water bodies because it's already absorbed and there's vegetation to protect it from leaking.
Hmm.
Now, compare that to something like a feed additive. A feed additive is something that you feed to animals to reduce the methane emissions coming from an animal. And methane is a big, climate change greenhouse gas. What that does is obviously, you are incentivizing an intensive system. You're improving the efficiency of the system, but you're not tackling the problem. So silvopasture is where you like, kind of wean the animal away from animal feed. You're letting it graze on the soil. But this animal feed system, animal feed additives, would be you're still sticking to intensive farming. So you still have all of the evils of that. And if you scale it up, you still get all of the, disadvantages of like you still have to use high chemical fertilizers. You still, you're not sucking any carbon into the soils, and you're just reducing the emissions minimally, but you're continuing to, sort of incentivize a system that is high emitting and
Yeah.
has huge impacts on the planet. So you're not going to get all of the benefits from doing that. There are some benefits, of course, you reduce climate change, but you're still sticking to a system that is still essentially doing the harms than more than good.
Yeah. Now, I suspect that the vast majority of people would prefer the more nature-based solutions. I mean, as you say, it's a better solution, but it's also more natural, I suppose. Well, it's what people like. So why is it so difficult to persuade farmers to use the nature-based solutions over the kind of technology-based solutions?
Yeah, I think not only the farmers, but the industry as well, right? I think there is a bit of a difficulty in employing some of the traditional financing instruments. So if I say I want to fund an anaerobic digester or a feed additive, I mean, that is a tangible product. So you can tie some debt equity sort of instruments onto that and say, like, okay, lending, I'll lend you this money, whatever. When it comes to regenerative agriculture or nature-based solutions, these are oftentimes practices that farmers employ, and it's very difficult to tie your traditional financing instruments to that because you want to tie it to a collateral, right? Something that's tangible, and this is not exactly tangible. So I think that's a bit of a difficulty. The other one is like sort of these things take time. So, I said about, sequestering or sucking carbon into the soil. It takes 20, 25, 30 years for the full benefits to be realized. But if I have a feed additive or an anaerobic digester, tomorrow I'm getting emission reductions. I don't need to wait for 20 years, 30 years. And again, so that patient capital sometimes is very difficult. And also for farmers, I mean, they're not realizing benefits overnight. They need to wait and they need to, I mean, so, and then this also plays into monetizing, right? We talk about carbon credits, we talk about biodiversity credits, we talk about subsidy schemes and incentives. It's very difficult to tie that into actual outcomes that you generate on farm. So I talked about the positive impacts across the planetary boundaries. So very good for biodiversity. I mean, what does that mean in terms of how much biodiversity has been, gained from transitioning, right? So how do you tie like a financial instrument to that? And that's really difficult. And
Okay.
again, I think the last thing is sort of, these are like highly complex issues, right? I mean, there's a huge, it's not only about throwing money at it, it's an administrative problem. It's a grassroots problem. So a lot of corporates or investors who want to help farmers, they need to work with a NGO or a farmer organization or a cooperative on the ground to be able to get the trust of farmers, to give them the confidence that this transition is worth it and they're going to be funding this transition, right? And like I said, there's a lot of comfort in status quo. Like we are all comfortable in in our daily habits or we have our daily routines. You're asking somebody to shift that overnight, and that's not easy. So I think this just transition element also comes in, and that requires a lot of trust building and a lot of like confidence given to farmers to make the switch. So it's we're calling for a paradigm shift, and that requires a lot of like not only the money, technical capacity, but also a lot of human relationships and collaboration across the value chain,
Yeah.
which we see lacking at the moment.
So yes, you've been talking about a transition and a just transition. Now, do you think this transition, this food transition, first of all, what is that food transition, and is it inevitable?
I think yeah, I think it is. I mean, I can talk about just transition, but also transition in general terms, right? A transition in general terms, I think, is inevitable because we're already seeing a lot of risk manifesting, like climate and nature risk manifesting in terms of profitability. We see some parts of the world that are not productive anymore. We're seeing like huge amount of yield and crop losses, even productivity to animals, right? I think in a changing climate, of course, we did some modeling looking at some of the future scenarios of climate change. And what we found was that the animal feed that you're using to feed the animals, they will decline productivity in the longer term. The heat itself and the water availability will have impacts on the livestock production itself and the productivity of the animal. And this is going to impact your profitability. So I think that is already like playing out, and a lot of investors and corporates are paying attention to this. So from that perspective, yeah, a transition is inevitable, but there are also opportunities. Like I said, these nature-based solutions could be opportunities which can safeguard your portfolios, and if you're looking at companies, their supply chains. And we see some investors already encashing on that. So, there are some investors who we have who are buying up degraded land or leasing degraded land and employing regenerative practices with the investment thesis that in 10, 15 years' time, these lands are going to be productive again because we're regenerating the soil health by employing regenerative practices, right? There are some investors who understand that relying on chemical inputs is not going to be sustainable in the future because we're going to run out of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in the future. So they are now investing in biological fertilizers and biopesticides because besides the environmental benefits from deploying them, they're also cutting out the dependence on synthetics. So they're in it for sustainable long term, right? So again, a lot of opportunities in the space, which a lot of investors are encashing as well. And from a corporate perspective, it's supply chain risk. I mean, they want to ensure that supply chain is resilient, and they don't want to source from regions or source from suppliers who cannot ensure consistent supply for the next 20, 25 years. And that's why they're also like incentivizing some of their suppliers to transition.
Mm.
Now, when it comes to the just question, I think obviously we need that's a very important one, right? Because farmers are at the forefront of any transition. I mean, we can sit in boardrooms and I can talk to investors and ask them like, hey, what are the instruments? I can talk to corporates, tell them like, oh, what is your supply chain strategy? What is your decarbonization strategy? By the end of the day, it is the farmers who have to deploy this on the ground. So I think, and it's I mean, obviously, like I said, they operate very low margins. For some of them, it's their only livelihood. That's the identity culturally as well. So asking them to do something different, which they're used to, I mean, they also need to be represented in some of these conversations, and they're not often not. So corporate target setting happens at the board level, and you have to meet your net zero targets and so on. But you're not asking a farmer to come on those conversations and say, hey, is that even feasible? What are some of the things that you're asking me to do? Are you financially backing me to do that? And
Mm.
for how long am I being backed? And what if I produce these regenerative products? Do I have a stable market for it? Are you going to give me a price premium? So these conversations need to be had to ensure that the people who actually, the stewards of the land, are a part of these conversations and are compensated fairly to make that transition. So obviously, keeping climate, nature, targets, and everything aside, the just transition element needs also to be a centerpiece, which we need to talk about when you talk about this transition.
Okay, so it sounds like a large part of that is governance, right?
Large part of that is governance. So yeah, we did a piece, 2 years ago, like I said, on regenerative agriculture, right? And our angle to this was, let's look at these commitments and see, are they really, are they only talking the talk or are they walking the walk in terms of really doing this? And obviously, we saw a bit of discrepancy when it comes to meeting climate and nature targets. They're setting targets, but they have no idea how they're going to meet those targets. So a bit of a risk of greenwashing there, right? When it comes to regenerative agriculture. But the most interesting thing that came out of the analysis, like I said, we looked at 79 agri-food companies. 50 of them mentioned regenerative agriculture. Only 4 out of those 50 companies have financial incentives for farmers to transition.
Mm.
So that 50 companies talking about regenerative agriculture and their commitment to sort of scale that, but only 4 out of 50 have any financial incentives. So this is such a huge disconnect, right, in terms of the governance. Let's say in terms of how are they going to deploy these strategies without getting the support of farmers? It's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when I mentioned governance, I was thinking more kind of political governance, from the top down. I mean, I suppose if you're relying on companies to supply the incentives, then yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I mean, yeah, we need all stakeholders along the value chain to be a part of this. But coming back to your governance question from a policy standpoint, policy is super important, right? I think if you're not creating a level playing field for private capital to operate in a market, they're not gonna come in. So,
Mm.
I mean, the main thing that we focus on is subsidies. So most of the time, the subsidies are not aligned with sustainable practices. So there are huge amounts of subsidies, I think around 500 billion or so, that's going towards practices that are not sustainable. So you would get subsidies based on the size of your land. You would get subsidies for using nitrogen fertilizers. So if you are getting subsidies as a farmer for doing these, how can an investor or corporate come in and say, hey, I want you to like stop using chemical fertilizers? I mean, you have to go over above and beyond some of those price distorting, environmentally harmful subsidies in order to make the transition.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things that we did as a part of our ask is because we are not, I mean, similar to your question, we're not naive to think that corporates and investors can drive this transition alone. So we had an investor statement where we asked the G20 ministry to repurpose some of these like environmentally distorting subsidies, and we got investor support, and we put an investor statement and sent it to them, right? We said like we need that, but it's not only about the subsidies angle. There also needs to be a strong indication from the governments that they're taking this seriously. So again, you have your nationally determined contributions from the governments for the Paris Agreement. You have the NBSAPs, but I don't even know what that stands for, but it's like National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans or something.
Yeah.
But these are things that countries are submitting in terms of how are they sort of meeting some of these climate and nature targets, right? And if they are not imposing that at a country level or a regional level, how are investors going to have the confidence to say that, hey, I'm going to go in and work with this company to change and transition to regenerative agriculture or cell-based meat or plant-based meat or whatever it is? So this confidence needs to be provided to investors from the governments, and that's, I mean, indispensable when it comes to like taking action, right? So yeah, your question is quite important. And again, I think like yeah, policy. I mean, policy and investors can work hand in hand, right? I think, it should not be like, oh, I mean, I'm working at a country level, but I mean, obviously companies operate there, companies source from there, investors invest in these companies. So there needs to be a conversation to be had there as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's a political hot potato, isn't it? In the same way that kind of sustainable energy. It was just yesterday that Richard Tice was uh, was was going to write to all the sustainable energy companies and kind of tell them if reform get in, then he's going to cancel all their contracts. So it's used very politically, and I imagine that if food got the same attention as energy, it would be just as much used kind of politically. So, I mean, and also, I suppose that when we look at the Paris Agreement, it only mentioned food at the last one. It was the first time that food was even talked about, right? And
Yeah,
and it's been kind of taken over by all the oil all the oil producers. So yes, it's a complicated topic, isn't it, to kind of talk about the policy and the government and all that. Which countries do you think are getting it right?
I mean, that's a difficult question. I think the UK is not doing pretty bad. I think the National Food Strategy that came out a couple of years ago by Henry Dimbleby and others, I think that was a good precedent in terms of understanding how the transition can look like for the UK. I wouldn't say any country is nailing it at the moment. I mean, obviously, I think, like I said, food is a very political issue because you see farmer protests. I think the EU is trying to do the right things, but at the same time, regulation is also complicated in the EU with omnibus and so on. So I think it requires multiple angles, right? One is like, okay, what are we asking companies to do in terms of disclosures? And that data is important for investors to make decisions. It's important for companies to understand where they stand in this in terms of sustainability journey and so on. But now we're saying it's too complicated. We're going to cut it down. EU was one of the front runners when it comes to like regulations. We saw like the EU deforestation regulation, right? Which looked at, okay, we're going to really look at the import and export of commodities that have deforestation attached to it. Obviously, now that didn't go through. Now it's kept in the back burner. With omnibus coming in, simplifying a lot of the disclosure requirements, I don't know what's going to happen to the regulations. EU also had a very strong greenwashing policy, which I thought was very, 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 good. But again, now I don't know what's going to happen to that as well. So I wouldn't say any country is getting it absolutely right. I would say Europe and UK in general. I think we've seen like some good policies coming out. I think obviously like the environmental land management scheme that was in the UK was quite good as well. They also have a good policy, decent enough policy in terms of like the innovation around alternative proteins and sort of cell-based foods and so on. But again, it's complicated. I mean, I can't like I said, it's not like having single hits, right? It's about getting the whole album
Yeah.
as a hit. So
So yeah, you mentioned earlier cultivated meat and cellular agriculture as part of the transition. How big, how a significant part of that transition do you think cultivated meat is going to be?
like I said, I think like regenerative agriculture or cultivated meat is not going to fully replace food production in the next 10 years or 20 years or whatever, right? But they would reshape the landscape in significant ways. And again, it's not about flipping a switch and saying that, oh, tomorrow onwards, I'm going to be regenerative or I'm going to be, using cultivated meat. I mean, we need a combination of all things. And again, like I said, agriculture is very context specific. It's very cultural. It's very social. So again, you need to like respect some of those factors and indicators when you are suggesting solutions. So we talk about a transition, and I was on the committee for the transition planning task force for the agri-food sector, right? And we came up with a transition plan for what companies should be reporting in terms of showing the ambition in terms of transitioning. But what we also realized is that we don't need a standardized transition plan because that's not going to apply in all regions. What we need is interoperability, right? A general set of guiding principles on what we think are some of the activities within the food sector that can contribute to a positive climate and nature target, but at the same time, be just and fair in terms of the transition. And how can these practices then be adapted to different regions and different contexts? So that is the story that we're trying to say at FAIRR as well, because we need to work on the supply side, and when I mean supply side, the production side. So we need to work on, are there better agri inputs? Are there better methods of production? Can we go towards biologicals? Can we go towards regenerative agriculture? But then, is that going to produce the same amount of food that we need on the consumer side? Probably not.
Mm.
Then how are we going to then replace that demand for food? Can we find low carbon alternatives to sort of replace that, right? And that's where your plant-based proteins come in. That's where your cell-based meat come in. That's where your meat alternatives come in. So I think it's a combination of both sides that has to work together. So yeah, I think there's no silver bullet. It would be my final position on
Yeah,
this.
yeah. I mean, I suppose there's still a lot of debate in regards to cultivated meat and cellular agriculture. And you mentioned earlier a hybrid using, kind of plant-based foods and probably kind of cultivated fats and things like that to flavor it and get that kind of Maillard, kind of taste sensation that people require.
Yeah.
So, uh, I mean, to what degree do you think that cultivated meat, I don't know, in the next 5 or 10 years, is going to reach uh, a kind of suitably scaled degree that it can replace some percentage of meat?
It's
It's a,
hard. It's the
it's a
same as
big
asking
question.
like,
I know it is. Yeah,
yeah,
I
it's
understand
hard. I don't think like, I mean, obviously, we would have to do some sort of scenario modeling and so on, right? To understand
that.
how that is. But it's very complicated, like I said, because at the moment, not a lot of countries allow for cell-based meat to operate, right? I think like, there's only a few countries. And again, in terms of the labeling requirements, in terms of the cost and affordability, I think we really don't have an indication. I mean, of course, I mean, with new R&D coming in, I think the cost is going down. The taste and affordability can also improve. But I wouldn't be able to like tell you that, okay, the next 5 years, 30% of the meat is going to be replaced by alternative proteins or plant-based meat. I would rather uh, focus on like the entire list of solutions. And I mean, there are interesting things happening as well. Like for let's take Oatly, for instance, right? Oatly is a very interesting company. Obviously, like they have a dairy replacement in oat milk, which is great. Um, but what they're also doing is that they're combining the production of oat in a regenerative manner, and then they're combining that with like downstream replacement of traditional dairy milk. I mean, those are the kind of companies or innovations that we need, rather than talking about like, okay, what is cell-based meat going to do? What is regenerative agriculture going to do? I mean, what is tackling food loss and food waste going to do, and so on, right? And I think again, like I said, food is very cultural, and I mean, it's been made political as well quite a bit. So I wouldn't want to chase like one solution alone. I would say like, we need to combine these solutions.
Yeah,
And I mean, like I said, I pointed out certain hurdles that we need to overcome for cell-based meat. And I think, like I said, like pet food is something that, might be a less intrusive way or a less political way to like kind of utilize it in that sense. And as I mean, and obviously that also comes with like a lot of environmental benefits. Um, But then, yeah, from human consumption standpoint, I think it's very hard to say what will be the share of
Yeah.
these food technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in the UK that our first regulatory approved cell cultivated meat is for pets. It's because we love our pets so much they get to try it first. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's also interesting going back to kind of collaboration between companies and Cargill are now working with enough, aren't they, to produce alternative protein products. So clearly it's something that the big companies are looking closely at. Do you think they're serious about it, or do you think they are just hedging their bets?
I think again, like I said, the a lot of companies who are front runners in this are realizing that it's a risk for long-term resilience, right? Especially supply chain resilience. I mean, if you're dependent on countries which are producing like which is like like let's say Brazil or China or um, obviously like and if they're producing things in an intensive manner and you're focusing on intensive production, it's not going to be enough for the next 20, 25 years to be able to sustain like the kind of productivity that you want to have and the kind of products you want to put out. And the companies you're talking about, like Cargill, obviously, then we sort of have General Mills or like Danone's, your Unilevers, your PepsiCo's, and so on. What they're doing is, again, their strategy is not to be like, oh, we're going to go cell-based meat or we're going to go plant-based. No, I mean, they invest huge amounts of money in regenerative agriculture as well. They're looking at like how to cut out food loss and food waste. I mean, they're improving efficiencies. They're working with farmers to make them transition into more sustainable practices. So I think we see a huge amount of investment going in this. And again, like I said, it's not about these companies of putting all this billions of dollars into this transition from a morality standpoint.
Mm.
It's because they understand the materiality of it on the supply chains, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we see huge commitments from General Mills on regenerative agriculture, huge commitments from Walmart on regenerative agriculture. Again, at the same time, Nestle with Purina and all that stuff. Again, going the diversifying the other side as well. So we see, yeah, companies also having like a basket of solutions and making huge investments because it's a risk for them, right? Soil health is a big issue. Soil degradation is a big issue for them. And I mean, there's only certain parts in the world that can produce food, right? And if you're depleting those very same land, you're not going to have like the same supply that you're going to get in the future. And they realize that, and that's why they want to change. And again, I mean, it's not only about looking at that, but what about indoor farming? What about vertical farming? And so there's a variety of technologies. And again, given agriculture is very context specific, I think you need to be able to adapt these solutions in various markets depending on how food is produced, right? I mean, maybe in African regions or maybe even India, like it's agrarian. Yeah, you need the support of farmers to transition. So it might not be an overnight transition to regenerative, but it might be a journey that you need to like support them financially, but also from a capability standpoint, right? And ensuring that the market is able to absorb some of these products. So when an offtake agreement is signed, by a corporate saying that I will purchase the regeneratively produced products from your farm for the next 5, 10 years at this price point, that gives confidence to the farmers to transition, right?
Mm.
And again, like you said, the policy signals, if there is policy signals from the UK government or the European government saying that, okay, cell-based meat, we can see that as a part of the transition. We're going to give you the regulatory requirements. We're going to like take away the labeling requirements and so on. That creates an environment for the market to thrive. So I think it needs a combination of different elements coming together, right? And I would definitely steer away from saying that there is a silver bullet. And this is something that we see investors also telling us that it's a diversified approach. I mean, we're not going to fixate ourselves on meat alternatives, or we're going to not fixate ourselves on regenerative agriculture. We want everything. And how can we innovate together so we can bring all solutions together?
Brilliant. Okay. All right, Sajeev. It's been fascinating. I could talk about this forever, but our time must come to an end. So thank you very much for coming on to Future of Foods and talking to me and educating me in the way that you have. And I'm sure I'll see you around at some point.
No, for sure. Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure.